The curriculum plan is solid. Latin, logic, rhetoric, great books, mathematics, the sciences. We really have a great plan. Executing on something this grand is actually a big challenge. So I said, I think the only thing that's missing as a classical cornerstone is an emphasis on what we call conversational learning. So you can go ahead and bring up the website when it's convenient, Bill, the Shared Inquiry website. I think it was in the 1980s when Larry and Sarah Bailey, still dear friends of mine, they have Clean Food Farm in like Puyallup, Washington, came and between them they have 4 or 5 college degrees, really, really intelligent, interesting people, came to me and said, Rodney, we'd like to introduce you to the Great Books Foundation and the Junior Great Books Conversation, which has been fleshed out as what's called shared inquiry as an approach to learning. And so, being the administrator that I am, we paid for them to go to the training. They came back and started a Great Books Conversation at Pullman Christian School, where I was the principal. I was like associate pastor of the church. In those organizations you do everything. And principal of the school, administrator of the church, etc. And wow, we got started on that. It was so meaningful. It was pretty amazing. We started training other teachers. I remember when Dr. Chris Stone, who's a veterinarian, gathered the students and they discussed the Scottish chiefs weekly as they were reading this wonderful romance, really, but it's about William Wallace and Braveheart. You might remember Mel Gibson's movie about that. In fact, I watched the trailer of his great speech from his horse just the other day, along with Kenneth Branagh's band of brothers and Jack Nicholson. You can't handle the truth, and just so inspiring. Well, my son Jess, who's 260 pounds, has boxed professionally, was the semi-pro rugby player, has owned his own business since he was 17, absolutely fell in love with the characters in that book, deeply. It was kind of amazing to watch a rough and tumble guy like this become so wrapped up. So when he graduated from high school, he and I went to Scotland. We went up the Wallace Monument. He was up there long before I was, and I was even almost fit at that time. And he said, Dad, you got to get up here. His sword is right here. Well, what happened that caused him to connect with the people, the romantic ideas of that book? And it's not a murderous book like the movie is. It's much more meaningful, deeper, much more emotive. It was really good conversations with his friends, with an excellent leader who didn't dominate the conversation. So what I'd like to do in the next about half an hour is talk about conversational learning, share the method that we're going to be using, show you some resources that would be helpful to you if you'd like to connect with this idea with your own children, which we would encourage. And then over the course of the whole school year, we're going to slowly implement this. We're not taking away didactic teaching. The teacher-initiated teaching will continue as a part of our pedagogy. Of course, drill and practice is a part of our pedagogy. Written composition and projects are part of our pedagogy. But we want to add the great conversation, and it ought to be obvious when observing the level of political discourse in the current political campaigns in the United States that people need to learn to talk to one another. And it's almost a lost art. We're connected with digital devices. We've learned to be cryptic in our conversations. We use emojis instead of words. We've forgotten to do punctuation. Spelling is corrected with the red squiggle. And there's something that is missing in the conversation. Now, some of those things keep us connected. I was texting with my wife while she and Rachel were going through the rose gardens in Portland, and while they were shopping together and scoping out Portland for my daughter's new store there. That was wonderful. It was so nice to stay in touch with my wife while we're a couple thousand or 1,500 miles apart. But that's different than coffee in the morning, where we, what I do with my phone right there, read our Bible study together and discuss it. It's a really, really important time to us. So I think we can all agree that ad hominem attack is not a way to have a good conversation with someone, and it's the most common thing since LBJ started attack ads in the 60s. Now we just shoot at people verbally. We spend billions of dollars on advertising, and as an intelligent voter, it's really hard to get a grasp of what a person would actually do if elected to office to represent us and to be the chief executive of what is currently the most powerful nation on earth. We're supposed to just take their word for it or their record for it. It's not good enough. We need to re-enter the great conversation. That phrase or that term was coined by the Great Books Foundation. Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins were at the University of Chicago together in the middle of the 21st century. They actually got rid of gridiron football. Imagine, they weren't in Texas, they were in Illinois. Because that couldn't happen here. Friday would have to be erased from the calendar, or at least Friday night. And what would Jerry do in Dallas? So shared inquiry, which is a trademark of the Great Books Foundation, and the best described method for applying what classical educators call Socratic dialogue. So you've heard of Socrates, he asked all kinds of questions and it got him killed. That's not what we're planning to do with your children. No, we're not going to teach them to overwhelm you when they get home, but they might. They need to be civilized in their discourse and conversation with you as well. So we're not going to teach them to be impolite. In fact, civil discourse more than implies that part of civilization is learning as people to have a back and forth intelligently with one another. This is a method of applying Socratic dialogue, a method of teaching and learning that enables people of all ages to explore the ideas, meaning, and information found in everything that they read. So you know how you can read something for pleasure? I've been reading some Steve Dancy Western novels because the first one was free. And it was just a fun distraction. It was a pretty light reading, and it's like, well, there's not a whole lot of deep questions about the makeup of civilization here. And you don't really need to take notes, because everything that I'm going to say right now, except for all the little parenthetical interjections, will be on this website, which I think Bill will probably email to you, and you'll have the link. See right in here, you can see there's a link that says Shared Inquiry. There are 4 videos here. If the sound booth could scroll down just a little bit to the videos. We don't really have time to show them, but those 4 blocks are like 2 to 5 minute videos that demonstrate this, that have leaders talking to you, that help you to understand what we're seeking to achieve. And then scroll back down and you'll see there's a downloadable PDF called the Shared Inquiry Handbook. Yeah, thank you. Right there, if you click on that, there's a 25-page handbook that you can download. 15 pages of it is instruction, and the rest of it is a couple of examples. One is the Gettysburg Address, and it includes interpretive and evaluative questions to follow, so you don't even have to make anything up. You can read the Gettysburg Address a couple of times, write down a couple answers to the interpretive questions, and try to have a discussion with maybe your husband or your wife about it. Something like that would be good, especially if one of you has roots in the North and one of you has roots in like South Carolina. That would be an interesting discussion about the war between the states. America's uncivil war, whatever you happen to be calling it. It centers on interpretive questions that have more than one plausible answer and can lead to engaging and insightful conversations about the text. In fact, the leader that comes to this discussion would best be asking questions to which he or she does not have a solid conclusion. I really want to talk about this. I'm not sure what I think about this. I remember in 2003 raising the question of the invasion of Iraq with my juniors and seniors while I was teaching omnibus myself. And I said, I am not sure about this yet. I'm reading on both sides of the issue. You know, what really ought we to do? Do I really believe there's weapons of mass destruction? And I'll tell you what, it was a difficult thing to get peace at any price and nuke the ragheads to come together into a civilized conversation, but I think we managed to do it. And it was a very important time. These young people were 17, almost 18 years old, draftable. And I said to them, you know, you're going to decide as voters whether or not my grandson is drafted. And they said, what is that? What's a draft? So I told them a story I won't tell you now about having a draft card and being in the last draft under President Nixon. And you can ask me the story in the lobby. It's another good one. But don't ask me a question unless you want a long answer. Bill does the short answers. And it's based on the conviction that participants can gain a deeper understanding of a text when they work together and are prompted by the skilled questioning of their discussion leader. In this type of discussion, each participant engages in an active search for the meaning of a work by reading closely, asking questions, and discussing actively. So there's real methodology to this. This is a pedagogical approach to the classroom that is rarely taught to educators, let alone to us as students when we were in school. Most of the time we sat rank and file, didn't we? Somebody up in front was giving a presentation, you took notes and took a test, and that was class. And this is very much a deeper way of doing things, and you have the benefit of having a school with a very, very low student-to-teacher ratio. Discussion leaders provide direction and guidance in order to get participants thinking, listening, and responding to questions and answers from others in their discussion groups. The participants in the group look to the discussion leader for questions, not answers. You know, oh, wow. Not, hey, Mr. Ravenet, what do you think about this? Mr. Dennison, what do you think about this? Etc. It's you know, there's a lull in the conversation and the leader might ask another question. But the leader is not ever supposed to give his or her opinion. I'm a terrible great books discussion leader. I got all kinds of sports opinions to give to you. I really have to discipline myself when I'm doing this with people. And it's selfish. You know, I have the mic right now, I can do what I want. But when you're in a discussion, it's not civilized to do that, it's selfish. So we're trying to teach the students to be unselfish, and in doing so, to learn to listen to others, and to do so actively. To know what kind of questions to ask. There are 5 key guidelines to engaging in a successful shared inquiry discussion. Conversational learning, Socratic dialogue, shared inquiry, they all come from the same classification of pedagogy. Participants must read the selection carefully before the discussion. Now, we're not going to be introducing new material to the students. The material that will be used for these conversations will come from their theology and Bible classes, from history and science, even from mathematics, literature, etc. So we're not going to load a bunch of new material on them. That would be a mistake. But when we're going to have a discussion about something, we're probably going to limit it to just a few pages out of a significant reading. So now, okay, read chapter such and such, or this portion of chapter such and such twice before you come to class, and write down some questions that you have. I wonder what Stephen Crane meant by. I wonder what President Lincoln was trying to get at when he said. You know, it's okay. You don't have to come to a discussion with all the questions answered. And this isn't a time to show off. It's a time with your friends, with your colleagues, with your classmates and your teacher to have a meaningful conversation. The goal of the group is to discuss the ideas in the text and explore them fully. Participants should support interpretations of the text with evidence from the work. And you'll see in the manual, and I've watched students do this and learned to do it myself because my whole doctorate used this method. When I was on the phone weekly with Dr. Chad Redwing, my primary tutor, or Dr. Robert Woods, who's now the head of the Covenant School in Dallas, and launched the Great Books graduate degree at Faulkner. I mean, these are just amazing people I got to talk with every Friday for 1 or 2 hours while I was doing my coursework. I had to bring the questions. I had to turn them in days ahead of time so that the professor knew what I wondered about. I wasn't supposed to know every answer about it. And, you know, when you're meeting with your teacher, you kind of want to impress them, right? Well, what's impressive is when you can listen to Dr. Redwing or listen to Dr. Woods and have a meaningful conversation with them, in this case, one-on-one. Everyone needs to listen carefully to other participants and respond to them directly. So if Johnny says something about Red Badge of Courage in class, and Sally is kind of twisting her nose going, say, Johnny, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what you're saying. So let me try to reflect back to you what I thought I heard you say. I think I heard you say this. And he goes, oh, no, that's not what I meant. Well, how often with your spouse or with your children or with a clerk at the store or with the pickup that just cut you off, do you have an interaction that permits them to say, that's not exactly what I meant, before you get in an argument? So it's critical, and the students will actually learn how to listen. So if you think about it, in terms of rhetoric, or how we learn to communicate and persuade, what's the first thing that a child learns? If you have writing, and you have reading, and you have listening, and you have speaking, what's the first thing that a little baby learns out of those 4? Listen. Now, you might not think so when they're crying and screaming and hungry or colicky, etc. But they, in terms of using words to communicate, the first thing they do is listen. The next thing that they learn is how to speak. And the next thing that they learn is how to read. And the next thing they learn is how to write. And what's the only thing out of those 4 that gets graded in most schools? In other words, what's most important to most schools? Just the writing. Gosh, what if we were able to actually say, these are the key elements of listening, and when you do it well, you get a gold star. I mean, it doesn't matter what the reward is, and part of the reward is the experience itself. Because if a student is enabled to do this kind of thing, they're going to have a more enjoyable life. So you learn to listen actively, learn to ask questions. You'll see in the videos even a situation in which a student says, well, I don't agree with you about that, and this is why. So it's okay to disagree, but it's not, you're an idiot. No, it's, I don't agree with you, and this is why, and this is where I found it in the book. But could you help me understand why you're saying what you're saying, and show me the evidence in the text that led you to that conclusion? So this is a methodology. It's not boring, it's not cumbersome, although it probably will be at first while we're learning to do it together. Participants, everyone needs to listen. The leader is there to ask questions rather than to offer his or her own interpretations of the text. And not an easy thing to do, but those principles, participants read the selection twice. The goal is to discuss the ideas and explore them more fully. Participants support their interpretations from specific places in the text that's being read. Everyone needs to listen carefully, and the leader is there to ask questions, not to offer hot sports opinions. There's 3 different kinds of questioning that go on in the shared inquiry method. Number 1, factual questions. Number 2, interpretive questions. And number 3, evaluative questions. Factual questions are who, what, when, where. Sometimes you have to contextualize, who is speaking here? Oh, this is Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States. What's he talking about? Well, the context is the Civil War. Well, when was that? 1861 to 1865. So where is he? He's in Gettysburg. Where's Gettysburg? I've been there. I remember I was there when I was 14 because my dad would incessantly take us on camping trips, and then we had to visit every blue sign or brown sign. Now, guess what I do? I'm pulled off to see the statue of Sacagawea and pulled off here to see the Lewis and Clark Trail when I was driving from Colorado to Washington. I do exactly what my dad taught me to do, and I'm delighted and enjoy it very, very, very much. So, how about an anecdote here? So, I was several years ago, while I was the head of Fortis Academy in Dallas, I was in the afternoon making my daily rounds on one of the campuses. It happened to be the Flower Mound campus, which houses about 650 students, although only about half of those each day, of course. It's not really that big. It's a 15-acre campus, something like that. I was walking down the hall and listening to what was going on in classes, thinking about ducking into a class and just sitting there for 3 or 4 minutes to listen and observe. This would have been a common practice for me, and it'll be a very common practice for Amanda, a little bit for Bill, and some for me as I teach them how to actively observe faculty and the activities of the students. But in this case, I heard children talking. And I don't mean like they were talking while they were doing an art project or something like that. I'm going, man, these young people are really discussing things. They were only in 5th grade. So we're talking what? You're about 10 in 5th grade? And I never heard the teacher speak. So I decided not to go in. The headmaster rolls in and it's a little bit disruptive, or can be, especially if I'm in a jovial mood and walk in telling jokes. So if this was the door, I just kind of stood like this, with a hand in a pocket, listening. And for 45 minutes, 10-year-olds with a student-led conversation engaged in a shared inquiry, great books discussion without the teacher speaking. Wow. Now, I don't suppose that was the norm at Fortis Academy or in most classes. But the teacher, who had to leave then a couple years later because someone got a new job somewhere and had to move. A lot of that happens in communities like this and communities like Flower Mound, Texas, just north of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. I was deeply impressed by that, and know that it was the teacher over the course of it was probably the springtime, so they'd been practicing this for some months, had so worked with the students that they were able to engage in civilized discourse with one another, answering and asking questions after having read the selection twice and came away having explored much more meaningfully the material that they had just studied. That's impressive. It would be nice if any of us could do such a thing in a meaningful way. Well, it's a little bit like learning composition. You know, when I remember being in grade school and they'd put a piece of blank paper in front of you and say, write whatever is on your mind. Actually, you don't want to know. All I'm thinking about is Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris. Those were baseball players. A long time ago, one of them is one of my passwords. I probably shouldn't tell you that. You know where they ask you who's your favorite athlete? True enough, I am that old and was in the right field bleachers, and there was Roger Maris, and Mickey Mantle was still in center field. I was about the age of these fifth graders at the time. I couldn't do what these fifth graders were doing. And my teacher, who I loved, and is another one of my passwords, I guess I better not tell you his name, he didn't run class quite this way, although he loved me so much that by the second day I was on the front row. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going into the Shared Inquiry Handbook. If there's someone operating this, could you please click on the handbook and go to about page 18? So I'm scrolling down. What I'm going to do is read part of the Gettysburg Address and then read you a few of the questions. And then you can ask some questions, and that'll be about all we're going to do today. So I know this isn't quite as lively as the pre-Amanda conversation. It's probably more important. Page 11. And the Gettysburg Address only takes just a few minutes to read. It's amazing. Abraham Lincoln, November 19, 1863, at Gettysburg. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. And what is the great work to which he is referring is one of the questions that we're going to find afterwards. Oh, what work? What's he referring to here? It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead, so what did they give their last full measure of devotion for? Was it the eradication of slavery? Was it keeping the Union together? Was it simply they were there and they were trying to survive? You could come up with all kinds of answers there, couldn't you, to more fully explore the text? And that's exactly what happens in these conversations. They gave the last full measure of their devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Was that what they gave their full measure for? To preserve that kind of government? So here's the opening interpretive question. It's down just a tiny bit there. What is the unfinished work to which Lincoln says his audience should be dedicated? Let's pause and think about that. If you have a writing instrument, you can go ahead and write down a couple of thoughts. What is the unfinished work to which Lincoln says his audience should be dedicated? What is the unfinished work? You'd probably give them just a couple more minutes because you really want them to think about it. And then you'd go ahead and say, let's go ahead and have a conversation about this. What is the unfinished work to which Lincoln says his audience should be dedicated? And the leader bites their lip and doesn't say anything. And I gave you a few tips. You know where I got those? Last Wednesday, because we discussed this piece during the teacher training. So what were a couple of the ideas there? Anyone want to offer? What was the unfinished work? Well, let me share something, which I wouldn't do as a leader. So you're following me on this, right? I think the unfinished work was that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The world was watching. Remember the city on the hill? I think that was John Winthrop. Back in whenever that was, I believe that was the 1600s. And then the War of the Revolution, or the War for Independence. The world was watching. Remember, most of these countries had monarchies, and they weren't even constitutional monarchies. They were absolute monarchies. So the idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people should not perish from the earth. The world was watching as we ripped one another apart. Would it survive so great a civil war? Would it survive the continuing practice of slavery? Would it survive if the nation was allowed to split after the secession? There's a lot to talk about here, isn't there? And that's exactly what you would do with your students. And then a couple of the follow-up question. Why does Lincoln begin his speech by reminding his listeners of the intentions of the founders of the United States and the length of time that has elapsed since the nation's beginning? So where is that? What are they talking about? 407 years ago. So question of fact, when was the speech given, and what's 87 years before that? And it's just about the time of the War of Independence, isn't it? Our fathers brought forth, or maybe the Declaration of Independence, forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So there's the introductory foray in the speech. Seems to me, which I would not do during a discussion, says, what is he meaning there? All men are created equal. Well, for sure he's talking about racism, right? For sure he's talking about slavery. Well, lots to talk about here, because even though President Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, in his own writings, you can see he didn't really care whether the slaves were freed. He cared whether the Union was preserved, and believed that the emancipation of the slaves was necessary to achieve that end. Not quite as heroic as it's made out to be, in my opinion. But you can see where, I'll tell you, Mr. Ravenay, who's really, really, really smart. I've only had one conversation with him so far. I'm impressed. Look forward to more. when we were talking last Wednesday, he raised his hand and gave an answer, and it was so eloquent, I could tell everybody else kind of went, oh. Like they didn't want to raise their hands and participate then, so I said, look what you just felt. And like a first grade teacher's going, yeah, that's exactly how I felt. Oh my gosh, how could I say anything quite as eloquent as Mr. Ravenay? Well, it's part of the reason you have the students write down their response to the interpretive question before you start to converse. Because someone might be able to say, well, while you said it better than I could repeat it, that's exactly what I was thinking. Was that da-da-da-da-da-da. Or, well, this is what I thought. And the reason I thought that was where it said government of the people, by the people, for the people. It seems to me that's the real issue, is preserving government that preserves liberty. No, it wasn't emancipation. It was preserving a government that preserved liberty. Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, that's another perspective. And you get a multi-layered discussion of a one-page speech that's one of the most famous pieces of American oratory. Let's look at the next question. Does this feel intimidating to you? I mean, you feel like you could kind of make your way into this and learn how to do this with your children at home? And you could see how exciting it would be to send to help your child prepare for class that's going to be a discussion class. Would be very different, wouldn't it? Maybe talking the issue over with your child at home. And in fact, we're planning to begin the scaffolding for this in first grade. So by that I mean simply that the students will learn how to listen to one another, how to discuss with one another, whether a first grade teacher conducts an actual shared inquiry approach with all of these details, I'm not sure. But when we were discussing this last Wednesday, Sabrina said, the first grade teacher said, well, I've done this before with students, not shared inquiry, but had a discussion and said to them, your mommies and daddies are often a part of a small group at which they might discuss the minister's sermon from Sunday morning on a Sunday evening or a Wednesday night. Or they might be in a book club where they've read a few chapters of a book and they come together and have a discussion. So we're going to do what grown-ups do. Oh my goodness, she said, the first graders kind of sat up like, wow, I'm not 6, I'm 60. Well, maybe 32. And I thought, wow, I couldn't have done what Sabrina did because I don't get 6-year-olds. To me it was time to get a bat and go outside. And what's this discussion? The only discussion to me was, can I please go outside? It wasn't as hot where I grew up in Richland, Washington, and then north of Yankee Stadium. So this is clearly a methodology to help students learn how to think. Now, perhaps the greatest logical fallacy that we are observing in political discourse right now is ad hominem, where we're going to tear down the person who's making the statement so we don't have to listen to the statement of the person. The students will be applying these kinds of logical fallacies to the text and to one another. Says, well, Johnny, that was a ad baculum argument, or that was an ad hominem argument. I feel like you just said, well, I'm not listening to this because it was Abraham Lincoln, and my dad says, someone from the deep South that's, really a defender of the Confederacy might have said something, and then hopefully someone else in the room will say, well, while I respect what your father said to you, you're just saying that Abraham Lincoln's a bad guy, and that's an ad hominem argument. Wow. So you can see how this will move the students into what some people call logic level learning. Now, I don't think logic is a level, to tell you the truth. It's a way of reasoning. But this helps the teachers and helps you at home to knead into the dough of the daily conversation the use of logical fallacies. And I don't know, we might already have a book for this. What do we use? The Art of Argument, is that Chris Perrin? And do the parents actually buy it for the students? So it's not just a teacher book. Have you ever seen the book, The Fallacy Detective? So those of you that have children younger than 7th grade, a really clever book on logical fallacies that makes this so easy to understand is called The Fallacy Detective. Are you back there, Amanda? Could you write that down, please? The Fallacy Detective. Very useful with younger children. It's got like a dog dressed up like Sherlock Holmes and it has a magnifying glass on the front, and the kids are hunting down logical fallacies. Now, they'll come home going, Mom, that was an ad hominem argument. Well, eat your peas anyway. And I know, and then you call me and say, what are you teaching them at school? So your kid's doing exactly what we hoped for, except for the civility part. Sorry. So, that's what we're planning to do when it comes to shared inquiry. I know as an extrovert, it was hard for me at times to be in class and be quiet. Can you imagine that? In fact, I met Mr. Kaiser, who was my favorite teacher and my 5th grade teacher, when I was about 57. I was running a classical Christian school just for a year in Cary, North Carolina, in the Research Triangle. I was Cary Christian School after Larry Stevenson had left, Dr. Stevenson. I was friends with his wife on Facebook because George didn't use any technology except a bat. I mean, he could hit a ball over 400 feet when we were 10. We thought he was a god, So she said, we're in Cary, North Carolina. I'm like, what? So am I. So I got to go see Mr. Kaiser and talk with him. And one of the things I asked him was, why did you move me to the front of the room? He goes, because you were having your own class in the back of the room. So? And he could still beat me. This thing where you go, shh. I could never get him when I was 10. And here he's about 70, and I'm 57, and I didn't get him once. That was just not right. It was demeaning. It was harmful to my self-image. So this is really meaningful stuff, and I want to assure you it's just going to be part of what we do, and we're not blowing up the school here and changing it into, what they do at that school? All they do is chat all day. They don't do any algebra problems. And we will use it even in a science class. Why not, if you're in physics, read some of Principia by Newton and discuss it rather than just doing calculations. It becomes more meaningful. Same with geometry. You want to talk your way through a theorem and discuss why it works rather than just memorize theorems. And that's not the idea of geometry. So, does anyone want to ask a question? I don't want to send you on your way if you want to. Okay, well, I'll be here through the day. I'm introducing for the upper school why we use omnibus and composition, the progymnosmata classical composition. So thank you for welcoming me, if in fact you have. You might be thinking, Brad's right back there if you want to register a complaint about the headmaster, and I look forward to getting to know you.